our speaker tonight, and we're lucky to have Smith, PhD in history, retired from UNCW, very, very active in historic preservation here in Wilmington. A speaker on military history topics, not just the Civil War, but other topics as well. And we're very, very lucky to have so many good speakers locally, good historians locally, and please welcome Dr. Ed Smith. Yeah, I guess we needed that little toolbar on the bottom. Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you. Appreciate that very kind introduction. Very happy to be here this evening. Thank you all for turning out to listen to this presentation. Can you all hear me okay? If you can't at any point, just raise your hand and flag me down. And, try to be a little bit louder. Our subject this evening is one of the many fascinating sidelights of the Civil War. It's the story of the only Confederate attack on Washington, D.C. occurred during that conflict. An attack that came perilously close to capturing Washington and reversing the entire war. It's also the story of how the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, was exposed to enemy fire and very nearly became casualty of the war himself. Obviously, Washington was not captured, and Lincoln survived, leading in cause of victory. But the might have been these little known events make up one of the most fascinating adventures of the Civil War experience. At the same time, they also cast a considerable amount of light onto one of the perennially interesting questions of the Civil War, which is the relative abilities of General Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee. It's a great story. Okay. Geography is essential to understanding topics. We're also going to have to talk with a bit about strategy, so we'll need to spend a little bit of time. The operations that I'm going to discuss took place in what is called an Eastern or Virginia theater of the Civil War. Theater being merely the military term for the geographic region where military operations take place. You can have a smaller theater within a larger. So, for example, we refer to the Valley Theater, which is part of the larger Virginia theater. The two rival capitals, Union and Confederacy, Washington, D.C., and Richmond, Virginia, out there. They were approximately 100 miles apart. Richmond is not a natural fortress, but nature had done a pretty good job of creating natural defenses for it. In the first place, you had a series of rivers running from west to east, emptying into Chesapeake Bay. Washington is on the Potomac River. Richmond is down here from the James. And in between that, you have the Rappahannock River, the Northern and South Anne rivers, the Rapidan, and further down here, the Appomattox. For about 2 years, from 1862 to 1864, the Rapidan River, right along here, was the de facto border between Union and Confederate territory. To the west of Richmond, there was the Spiny Ridge running along Virginia's backbone, composed of the Blue Ridge and Allegheny Mountains. And in between that, the broad corridor that was referred to as the Valley of Virginia. The northern portion of the valley is the portion from which the Shenandoah River flows, which by the way is in the Potomac, Harper's Ferry, And so that portion of the valley is frequently known as the Shenandoah Valley. And it's one of the interesting trivia points of the Civil War that people sometimes get confused about, because the Shenandoah River runs south to north, emptying into the Potomac. The northern part of the valley is referred to as the lower valley, and the southern part of the valley is the upper valley. If you have a army moving from southwest to the east, it's moving down the valley. And conversely, if it's going in the other direction, it's moving up the valley. The other significant feature of the Virginia Theater was man-made, and that was the railroad. Richmond sits within what is approximately a trapezoid, with its four corners being formed by Hanover, Charlottesville, Lynchburg, and Petersburg. In order to successfully defend Richmond and to maintain its supplies and military material, the Confederates needed to defend all 4 points of that trapezoid. From it, westward, from Lynchburg, ran the South's principal railroad connection with Tennessee, which was the Virginia and Tennessee Railroad. And from Petersburg, there were railroads running south, a railroad running south, which at the Virginia state line became the Wilmington and Weldon Route, which terminated here in Wilmington and was, of course, necessary for the movements of supplies coming into the Cape Fear River. On the northern side, the principal railroad line was the Baltimore, Ohio, which ran westward from Baltimore and also extended into the western portion of the United States. Our story begins in February of 1864. That was the month in which Ulysses S. Grant was appointed General-in-Chief of the armies of the United States. Grant was a resident of Illinois. He had a largely unsuccessful career in the army and also in business. He was primarily thought of as a relative failure, whose lack of success was caused by the fondness for drink. But when he entered the army again at the beginning of the war, he rose rapidly in rank and his achievement. By 1864, he was being celebrated as the victor who had captured Vicksburg and also the siege of Chattanooga in Tennessee. Lincoln brought him to the east with very high hopes, and to signal the fact that this was an important appointment, Grant was elevated above all of his peers by being appointed to the new rank of Lieutenant Governor. Commanding general that Grant replaced was General Henry W. Halleck. He had held his position since 1862, and ironically, he owed his own appointment as commanding general to several victories that Grant himself had won, while Grant was serving as his subordinate in the western theater of the Civil War. When Halleck finally got to Washington, D.C., they discovered that he was a very timid general, unaggressive, very much a desk general rather than field commander. He had considerable talent as an administrator and also as a coordinator, but when it came to actually directing armies in the field, he was pretty much a complete failure. Lincoln tolerated him for 2 years. In 1864, replaced him with Grant and relegated him to a new position under Grant called Chief of Staff, the United States Army. It was believed that his coordinating and the administrative ability would continue to be useful in terms of being able to assist Grant in running of all of the departments. Next slide, please. Well, this is the map we looked at a moment ago, and it has the various troop dispositions in the Eastern Theater starting in 1864. Grant had under his command two major field armies. One was the Army of the Potomac, which at that time was stationed at October, back in the East. Was the Army of the Potomac. The other was the Army of the James, which was stationed at Fort Monroe in Norfolk. Then, in addition to that, there were at least 3 military departments in the vicinity of Washington, all of which were primarily defensive in nature. There was the Department of Washington itself, which was primarily intended to defend the American capital. There was the Department of West Virginia, its primary purpose was to protect the Baltimore Railroad. Then there was the Middle Department, which was stationed in Baltimore. Baltimore was a city which had many southern sympathies during the war, and it was basically held in moving by force. So the Middle Department was essentially the remedy for occupation. On the southern side, you had the Army of Northern Virginia, which was the primary defense of Richmond. The Valley District was under the command of the Army of Northern Virginia. It's basically a cavalry outpost that was stationed in the Shenandoah Valley to defend Richmond, knowledgeable about affairs there. Then there was the Trans-Allegheny Department, which covered the Valley and West Virginia. There was the Department of North Carolina and Southern Virginia, which was mostly a North Carolina department, responsible for the Pennsylvania theater. They were also extended as far north as the Appomattox River in Virginia. So Petersburg was under his jurisdiction. Now, it's important as we go along to remember the fact that with the appointment of Grant, all of the northern departments were consolidated. In fact, we had one commander. Grant could give orders to anyone in this area with respect to what was being observed. On the Confederate side, however, the Army of Northern Virginia is separate from and distinct from the Trans-Allegheny Department, the Department of North Carolina and Southern Virginia. The Confederacy did not have a commanding general until very late in the Civil War, nor did the chief of staff. So, in other words, Robert A. Lee, who we all know as the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, was equal in stature to the commanders of the Trans-Allegheny Department and the Department of North Carolina and Southern Virginia. He could not issue orders to them directly. That had to be coordinated with the Confederate War Department and the President Jefferson Davis. Next slide, please. Grant's plan for this theater that he evolved in the spring of 1864 was basically that all of the armies of the United States would advance simultaneously. If you remember the map that we just looked at, the Army of the Potomac is in the center, the Army of the James comprises the federal left flank, and the Army of West Virginia consists of its right flank. And so all of the forces in these various departments began marching towards Richmond simultaneously. The theory was that they would put a great deal of pressure on the enemy, too much to withstand, and hopefully improve the air resistance. So that was the range of strategic design that Grant evolved in his first couple of months as commanding general. All the personalities of these various jurisdictions were going to play an important role in becoming the campaign. General George G. Meade was the commander of the Army of the Potomac. He was the latest in a string of leading commanders, all of whom previously had failed spectacularly in their duties. He was appointed right before the Battle of Gettysburg, and of course, that was the Northern victory, which was sufficient to keep Meade in command into 1864. However, he was widely regarded as not a terribly aggressive or imaginative kind of general. And so very early in his tenure as general in chief, Grant decided that he would travel with the Army of the Potomac and that he would supervise its activities in the field. Commander of the Army of the James was Major General Benjamin F. Butler. His qualification to be a military commander was that he was an important senator from the state of Massachusetts. He is a prime example of that category of officer known in the Civil War as a political general. Political general was one who owed his high command to his political connections rather than to his military ability. And generally speaking, that stature was enough to ensure him against any possible failure. Butler's ineptness as a commander had been very well demonstrated by 1864. He was politically very prominent, so here he was working as commander. Next. Commander of the Army of West Virginia was General Francis Sigel. Now, here we have a much more difficult problem with characterization, because very many Civil War historians, you ask them about Francis Sigel, they describe him as yet another inept political general. And that really isn't true. Sigel had as much military training as anybody who graduated from West Point, and far more field experience than the average West Pointer did. He was a native of Baden in Germany, and in 1848 he had served as the commander-in-chief during the Liberal Revolution in Germany, which ended up being crushed by the Prussian army. When that happened, like thousands of other German expatriates, he left Germany, came to the United States, settled in the Midwest, and became an active leader of the German American community there. In the middle of the 19th century, discrimination against immigrants was rife in the United States. And the bigotry that was demonstrated against them was oftentimes as vicious as the racism that was directed against Blacks and Indians. Because that kind of discrimination has mostly disappeared in the United States today, historians tend not to be very sensitive to it. If Sigel had been a member of a minority group, there is very little doubt that by now he would have attracted a legion of religious historians, all of whom were intent on rescuing his reputation. It would be acknowledged that he was the victim of bigotry and intolerance, and that he did not have the esteem of either his subordinates or his superiors, and therefore that his failure in command was destined to be pretty much a self-fulfilling prophecy. But unfortunately, most Civil War historians still tend to take him at the evaluation that his contemporaries had for him. They consider him to be an inept political general. As we're going to see in the course of this talk, the truth is very much different than that. Sigel's forces, as I mentioned, were primarily intended to guard the Baltimore and Ohio River. One of his chief subordinates was a brigadier general named George Burke, who was stationed in the town of Beverly, West Virginia, when the first Civil War. Now, Burke was a regular officer, but he had connections too. And in this case, the connections were military. He had been General Philip Sheridan's roommate at West Point. And General Sheridan was one of Grant's principal cavalry commanders, on whom Grant relied. And it would appear that Sheridan used his influence to promote the interests of General Burke. Because when it came time to plan the 1864 campaign, General Grant ignored General Sigel completely. Held the same opinion of him that everybody else did. Hopelessly without him. Instead, he seems to have regarded Burke as the real soldier in the Department of West Virginia. So Grant consulted with Burke. It was Burke who developed the initial plans in the standard, which unfortunately failed to measure up to the confidence that Grant had put in. There was also the commander of the Naval Department, General Luke Wallace. Wallace was an attorney from Indiana. It's probably best remembered nowadays for having written a famous novel, Van Burke. He was a soldier in the Mexican War, and as a consequence of that, he had no trouble getting in command of the regiment at the start of the Civil War. He rose rapidly in rank and ended up as one of Grant's subordinates during the Shiloh Campaign in 1862. Unfortunately, during the Battle of Shiloh, Wallace was very slow in getting his troops into action. Grant was taken by surprise by the Confederate attack at Shiloh. And although the battle was a victory, Grant was heavily criticized for his leadership and almost lost his command during the battle. Wallace provided a very convenient scapegoat for Grant. Grant didn't trust him, refused to admit that he had any ability as a general, and basically wrote him off as a man. Wallace ended up being transferred to the Eastern Theater, where in the early part of 1864, he was made commander of the Middle Department. And that, of course, by the fortunes of war, brought him right back under the control of the USS rank. Now, the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, we all know, was Robert E. Lee. He had held this position since 1862, and in that period of time, he had fended off 4 successive advances of the Army of Potomac, and there were 2 occasions of Northern Territory himself. We'll be saying quite a bit about Lee and his attitude towards the latest federal threat as we go along. Here, I will simply want to mention once again that Lee is a departmental commander. He is not the supreme commander of the Confederate forces in Virginia. He wants to get something done for the defense of Richmond and lost some of the department. He's not really from the Confederate War Department, and President Jefferson Davis to get it taken care of. Commander of the Trans-Allegheny Department was General John C. Breckinridge, who had a very distinguished career both before and during the Civil War. Breckinridge was a native of Kentucky. He had gone to the House of Representatives, and in the 1850s, he cooperated with Senator Stephen A. Douglas in the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, 1864. If you remember your American history, this was one of many doomed attempts to try to compromise on the issue of slavery and fend off the coming Civil War. After that, he served as the Vice President of the United States in President James Buchanan's administration. And in 1860, he had been a candidate for president himself. He represented the Southern wing, very badly divided Democratic Party, which of course lost to the Democratic. After that, he cast in his lot with the Confederacy. He advanced rapidly in rank. But unfortunately, at the Battle of Chickamauga in Battle of Chattanooga in 1863, he had the misfortune of commanding the portion of the federal line on Missionary Bridge, which was overrun by Grant's attack. So he lost his command. He was brought back to Richmond. Jefferson Davis, however, who was basically a very good judge of military character, continued to have faith in him. So early in 1864, he was placed in command of the Trans-Allegheny. Next. Both Lee and Breckinridge were very fortunate in having able subordinates, including the 2 cavalry commanders shown here. John D. Imboden was the commander of the Valley District, which, as we pointed out, was under the jurisdiction of the Army of Northern Virginia. Imboden had basically only a few cavalry with him, but he was responsible for keeping tabs on federal movements, notifying Lee if something like this was taking place. John McCausland was a native of what is now West Virginia. He served in southwestern Virginia for 2 years prior to 1864, and he had gained the reputation there as a very able, very aggressive, and extremely tough commander. And finally, we have the Creole General of P.G.T. Beauregard, who was the commander of the Department of North Carolina and Southern Virginia. Beauregard was an officer who was often at odds with Confederate political leadership. He and Jefferson Davis really disagreed, but he was a very able commander, as he showed in a number of jobs, including his most recent assignment, which was the defense of Charleston, South Carolina. In the summer of 1863, he managed to repel a series of very determined Union Army and Navy attacks from Charleston, which were intended to try to force their way into Charleston Harbor, recapture Fort Sumter, and return Charleston to the northern border. In early 1864, he was transferred to this department and made his headquarters at Berlin, North Carolina. His responsibilities, as we previously pointed out, included running the period. At the time he was appointed to command, his department was known as the Department of North Carolina and Cape Fear. The Beauregard changed to the Department of North Carolina in Southern Virginia. As it turned out, that emphasis on the Virginia portions and around Petersburg was very important for the Confederate force. What's usually known as Grant's overland campaign began in May of 1864 and lasted into June. There was not a great deal of technical subtlety of it. It was basically a headlong attack of the Army of Northern Virginia. Grant simply marched south and started swimming. When Lee fought him to a standstill, Grant would attempt to move around Lee's right flank. Then the two armies would confront each other again, and the pattern would be repeated. This happened with the Lotus, Spotsylvania Courthouse, began at Cold Harbor. Casualties during this campaign were horrendous, particularly at Cold Harbor, but the North had replaced its losses, whereas every man who was lost to the Confederate cause was an absolute loss that the Confederacy would not replace. Incidentally, as I go along here, I'm not going to be talking much about troop strengths and numbers and losses. That sort of thing is basically peripheral to the story, so I think I'm going to restrict it to those portions of the story that directly pertain to the tale of the telling. I find that there are a lot of people who get really fascinated by this sort of thing, and they just love to jump in and challenge and debate and argue about figures, many of which are quite controversial. So I think we can simplify things a little bit and simply talk about strategy, which is what I'm really interested in. As for General Butler and the Army of the James, Butler transported his army to Bermuda Hundred. It was a peninsula. The James were along the base of that peninsula ran the railroad between Richmond and Petersburg. If Butler, occupying this area, had moved quickly, he would have cut the railroad and posed a very serious threat indeed to the League and the defense of Richmond. Butler was reporting on the floor, was not much of a general. General Beauregard was able to get his forces up to the peninsula in time to draw a defensive line across the base of the peninsula. From that point on, it was really a matter of opinion as to who was besieging who. Grant's expression was very expressive. He said that Butler was in a bottle tightly plugged. Okay, now we're in West Virginia. We need to talk about how the strategy for that area developed. As we pointed out, General Grant ignored General Siegel completely in framing the strategy. He brought General Crook to Washington to consult. And what came out of this, we presume, was a plan that General Crook was primarily responsible for developing. What General Crook proposed was to form two Union columns, one of which would start off from the town of Beverly, West Virginia, the other of which would be beginning its march at Gully Bridge. The Beverly column would move south in order to try to take Covington, which were given access to the railroad at Stanton and Charlottesville. The column was started off on Golden Bridge, which was completely independent, so the coordination between these two columns. It was also going to north-south and attempt to get the Virginia and Tennessee Railroad either at Dublin or at Whitefield, where there was a major bridge across the river that interrupted Confederate communications. You don't have to be a strategic expert on the Civil War to see that this was a very uninspired plan. It really didn't accomplish much of anything. It certainly didn't fulfill any kind of goal threatening news around the flight. Furthermore, before very long, it appeared that Clark wasn't very knowledgeable about the geography of this region. The Beverly portion of the Beverly column was unworkable. Even in April, the passes through the Allegheny Mountains that the column would have to go through were choked with snow that was a yard deep. And an officer who was sent out to assess the road conditions at Beverly replied very pungently that the road system at Beverly consisted of one continued canal of mud 3 and 4 feet deep with pointed rocks. So that put paid to one entire wing of this particular advance. In the middle of April, it was General Siegel came up with a much better idea. General Siegel proposed that the column of Beverly be abandoned completely. Instead of that, all the troops at Beverly should be concentrated at Golden Bridge. And then from Golden Bridge, General Clark should bring his forces east to threaten coming. Meanwhile, General Siegel would bring a small force of men down from Purpose Ferry, I should say correctly. They would march up the Shenandoah Valley. The two wings of the federal pincers movement would close and hopefully, ultimately, result in the capture of the town of Stanton, Virginia, which is pronounced differently from the way it's spelled. By taking Stanton, the Union forces would indeed be not only united, but they would be in a perfect position to threaten Louis and Louis' career for that front. It was a much, much better plan, Grant adopted. However, in his memoirs, many years later, which he published in the 1880s, Grant ignored completely the very first humble effort that he had made in making a plan for this Virginia. He forgot all about those counter raids, small raids that had taken place. Instead of that, he presented the pincers movement from Stanton as his own idea. And even at that point, he didn't really understand what Siegel had done, because in Siegel's mind, the principal advance was going to be across, coming from Golden Bridge. And all that Siegel was supposed to do was basically distract the Confederates' attention while Cook came in from the rear and launched the major offensive against Okay, next. And then let's go back to that. Things didn't work out the way Grant did. The main reason they didn't was because General Clark disobeyed his orders. Instead of taking his force east towards Stanton, as he was supposed to do, he basically reverted to his original plan. He marched off to the south with his troops to the Virginia and Tennessee River. Now, you can speculate as to why he did this. One possible reason is that this was the original plan. He liked it. He was going to carry it out, regardless of what anybody thought. Another possibility is that he felt that General Grant was interested in a raid on the railroad, and so that's what he was going to do. And since nobody trusted General Siegel, he figured he could have been boring completely, and we do whatever he intended. But in any event, whatever his reasoning was, that's what he did. He started marching his troops down the south against the railroad Of course, taking him in the opposite direction from Siegel, who was coming from the valley from here. So now it's and in fact, Crook succeeded pretty much in doing what he originally intended to do. He took his army all the way down to the railroad and captured Dublin on May 9th, 1864. He burned the railroad bridge over New River. He then sent some cavalry out in the direction of Whiteville. Whiteville had some so it would have been valuable if he had captured it, but again, it was just kind of an afterthought. He had no attention paid to it. Local vendors disposed of the column very easily, resisted and after having accomplished his one sole achievement for the railroad bridge, he retreated back to the bridge. He succeeded in interrupting Confederate transportation on the railroad for a short period, but basically it wasn't much of anything, didn't last for very long. The bridge was completely built, the communications between Richmond and Tennessee were so he basically taken himself out of the war, and in the process, he had left Siegel over the valley down. Siegel occupied Winchester. He then began moving farther south. But by now he knew that Crook was not going to be coming to his assistance, and that he was isolated in Confederate territory. So his movements became rather tentative and aggressive. As for Breckinridge, who was in command of the Confederate commander in this area, he ignored Crook completely. Took all of his available field forces and he brought them east from West Virginia, through Lexington, and down the valley to confront Siegel. The two forces encountered themselves and encountered each other at the town of New Market, May 15th, 1864. Without going into a lot of detail, Breckinridge took the defensive. He launched a front attack to Siegel's forces. And meanwhile, his cavalry, which was under the command of General Verhoeven, snuck around the Federal left flank into the Union around his rear. At that point, it was pretty much over. Some of Siegel's men stood and fought bravely. The majority of them took off for the north as fast. Incidentally, on the table back there is a copy of the standard history of 911 Japanese. Very interesting story that you may want to follow up if you're interested in this. What everybody remembers about New Market today is at the being like cadets. They've been gathered up along with the other Confederate defenders of Lexington. The Breckinridge came through, and they served very incredibly. They participated in the charge against the Union Center. They sustained a number of casualties, and this is all more remarkable because the youngest member of the cadet corps was in the American directly with 14 years old. And this is an event that is still celebrated a great deal. You can pretty much figure out what happened to Siegel at the close of this campaign. He lost his position as departmental commander. And he sent him back to Harper's Ferry to take command of the garrison. Now, that was actually going to turn out to be rather important. But for the moment, Siegel was totally out of the picture. His replacement was this officer here, Major General David Hunter. Hunter was a regular soldier, that is to say, a professional. He was remembered in Army circles mostly because he was a crusading abolitionist. He hated slavery with a passion. He hated the South. He hated all Southerners. He wanted to do as much damage and destruction to them as he possibly could. And however admirable that might be, or the way regret nowadays, it caused Abraham Lincoln no regard. In early 1862, while he was commanding the Department of the South, he had supervised the taking of Fort Pulaski, Savannah River, Georgia. Immediately after the taking of Fort Pulaski, he had proclaimed immediate emancipation of all slaves in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. This is early 1862. His Emancipation Proclamation lasted 10 days. Abraham Lincoln surveyed the prevailing winds and probably was about it. He didn't replace Hunter in command, and what he did was much more subtle. He detached him from his headquarters and sent him off on important marshals and various other detached units that took him to Washington and other places and kept him on the field. And so Hunter was basically relegated to the shelf until May of 1864, when in the break of the Battle of New Market, he was put in charge of the forces that retreated from that battle. Hunter put his forces in motion 11 days after the Battle of New Market. That is on May 15th, this is May 26th, as the best. In this unusual caught Robert E. Lee by surprise. He was not expecting the forces of the Shenandoah to resume the offensive that quickly. He had given orders to Breckinridge to bring Breckinridge's forces east to join the Army of Virginia. Lee had sustained enormous casualties in the overland campaign and badly needed reinforcement. He figured he could away with bringing Breckinridge to the Army of Virginia, but affairs in the Shenandoah take care of themselves. Hunter's advance, therefore, basically was against the battle. There was no one in the Confederate side, no effective defenders in the battle to defend against these commands. So from Strasburg, which is where he began his advance, Hunter moved south, moved through New Market, came down to a small community called Piedmont, where we brushed a small force of Confederate defenders out of the way. And then, the day afterwards, in 1864, he marched in the state. And here, he was in a perfect position to realize what Siegel had intended originally, which was to have a large federal force for the instant flank in his rear. On June 8th, he was joined by General Crook. General Crook was back out here in West Virginia after his raid on the bridge. He received peremptory orders from Grant to fulfill the mission he had been assigned, get his army to the east, which he had not done. So Crook brings his forces from West Virginia into the Shenandoah Valley and unites with General Hunter on June 8th. And here I think we can get the truth. With those two forces from West Virginia united, the Army was probably somewhere in the vicinity of 19,000. At this point, Hunter made a grievous error that wiped out all of his accomplishments. He's insane, okay? Now, the logical route, the way he should have gone, was to march east. If he had done that, he would have come through the Shenandoah Valley, hopefully taken Charlottesville and Gordonsville. Remember, those are two of the points in that trapezoidal track that we have to defend. And that would have put Lee in a very bad body indeed. But there was one problem with this idea. If Hunter moved to the east like that, sooner or later, he would sort of be absorbed into the Army of the Potomac. General Grant was going to follow him and bring in the army for reinforcements of the Potomac. And if that happened, Hunter was no longer a departmental commander who was in charge of his own expedition, his own field. He was a corps leader in the Army of the Potomac under Grant's command. So Hunter found all sorts of reasons why he couldn't march east. Instead, he marched south Stanton with the intent of taking the city of Richmond. That was an important strategic goal, but it took him farther away from the times that were contending in this area. And he complicated his errors by not moving directly between Stanton and Lynchburg, but by detouring over to the west to take the city of Lexington. And that added a couple of days to his march. It didn't give a commander like Arthur Lee a couple of extra days to do something he did not expect us to do something. Lee had to do something to prevent the capture of Lynchburg. That would have severed completely the Virginia and Tennessee River. Couldn't allow that to happen. So he made the very tough decision to divide his own forces in front of Richmond, in spite of the fact that he was facing Grant and the entire army of the Potomac. On June 12, 1864, he called the commander of the Second Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia, General A. Early, into his headquarters and told him to take the entire Second Corps, the Army of Northern Virginia, and dispose of that. Now, this was a very drastic decision because Lee only had 3 forts in his entire line. Then he was attaching one of them to go to the Shenandoah Valley to take care of Hunter. However, you could depend upon Early to get the most out of any kind of detached service in that. Early is a very potent character. So maybe 47 years old at the time. He was profane, he was sarcastic, he didn't give a hang about his personal appearance. You can tell that from his photograph here. He couldn't even bother to spruce himself up in the portrait. But he was a very aggressive commander, independently minded, and counted on to get the most out of his men. And he also had under his command the Second Corps, which was the corps that Stonewall Jackson had originally commanded. And the nucleus of it was the force that Stonewall Jackson had in the Shenandoah Valley in 1862. So these men were returning to their own strong force. And that is precisely what Early Mercy did. On June 18th, Early was in Lynchburg, barely in time. The federal forces were approaching from the west. Breckinridge was already there, so we're in Logan and the Causeway. But the arrival of the Second Corps gave the Confederates somewhere in the vicinity of 18,000 men. And their very appearance was enough to put them in the general. They immediately decided that he was going to retreat. So Early had succeeded with this plan of saving his protection. And here, under strategic errors caught up with him. He's here down here at Lynchburg. If he tries to retreat back north to Stanton, then Early, using the Southern Railroad network, and comes from Lynchburg up to Charlottesville, and Charlottesville comes to Stanton. You will never get there before under Pingle Creek and Kylo. So Hunter is forced to do the only thing he can, takes his army, and he retreats into Western. He didn't stop his retreat before we got to Golden Bridge, at which time was said they tolerated Lincoln for playing in this process, he left the entire Shenandoah Valley corridor open. And so Early, taking what he found of Stonewall Jackson's, immediately put his forces in motion down the valley. And by the beginning of July, he was threatening for the Siegel, who was down in the valley of the Spirit. And that put Siegel in a very bad light because I don't know if some people are familiar with other stories, other than getting there. But it's located down in the hole. It's completely defensive. So the only thing that Siegel could do was to retreat from Harper's Ferry and pull his forces back across the Potomac River to occupy the heights on the other side of the river, which were called Maryland. the reports and heavy artillery that were placed there. So once he had occupied Maryland Heights, he himself and his team were safe. And by doing this, he had done exactly what Early didn't want him to do. Because if he hadn't occupied Maryland Heights, Early could have crossed the river too, moved along the roadbed of the Long War and up the railroad over to the east in the direction of the river. As it was, because Siegel was sitting there in Maryland Heights, Early had to move further to the north and then cross the mountains in order to Frederick to get into a single area. This is a very rare and unusual photograph. It shows Confederate soldiers in Frederick. There were Confederate soldiers there on 2 occasions. Once during the Gettysburg campaign and again in 1864. We don't know on which of these 2 occasions the photograph was taken. But regardless of that, it's an extremely interesting, rare photograph that these men actually. Well, this movement of Early's brought Wallace into the picture because Wallace was in Baltimore and the Montgomery River near Frederick was the western border of his department. The Baltimore Ohio Railroad crossed the river there, and more importantly, the road forked right after he crossed the Montgomery River. One road went south, and that led to Washington, D.C., the other road went east towards Baltimore. And so it was obvious that Early had designs on either one city or the other. Wallace was in the only position possible to try to proceed. So he mobilizes his small force, moves to the totally without orders. Grant, people will remember, didn't trust him. Grant didn't even bother to tell him that there were Confederates in the area. Didn't give him any orders. Wallace acted on his information. In fact, during this period, the Union High Command lost all control over what was happening in battle. Between June 18th and July 4th, which is a period of more than 4 weeks, Grant basically sits in his headquarters near the Army of the Potomac and does practically nothing. At this time, he's near Petersburg. Grant apparently felt that in this situation, General Halleck should take command and decide what was to be done. The problem was that Halleck was no longer a commanding officer, and it wasn't a field commander of the division. And as Chief of Staff of the United States Army, he really wasn't under any obligation at all to do anything about the situation. So Halleck passes on information to Grant. Halleck says, well, you know, you might want to do this, you might want to do that. Grant ignores most of what Halleck is telling him, sometimes for days, until the situation becomes critical. And so it isn't until July 4th that Grant suddenly realizes that the entire Corps is going from Cleveland and that Maryland is in danger. At that point, he attaches a vision of his own army, 6th Corps, headed by General Ricketts, and orders them to reinforce Maryland Heights. As it happened, the commander, General Ricketts, got to the Montgomery River just about the time that Wallace was completing his constitution. Ricketts has no idea what's going on. But Wallace manages to convince him that he should not try to proceed alone and do anything like Maryland Heights. The thing to do was to resist the Confederates wherever they were. That turned out to be a very crucial decision to make. Battle of the Montgomery takes place on June 9th, 1864. And it isn't much of a contest because the Federals have maybe 7,000 men against 18,000. But the Union force gave a very good account of itself. It held out for most of the day, didn't retreat until evening, and in doing that, it delayed Early by 1 additional day. And it also forced Early to reveal what he was going to do. Because Early massed his forces against the Washington War. Didn't mass them against the Baltimore. And so Wallace now knew what Early's intention was. was impending demolition by Washington, D.C. That was the message. Finally, July 9th, 1864, that hits the grant at Petersburg. The capital went into a panic. A string of forts has been erected around Washington. They're very strong, which needed that many of the garrison to probably. Most of the trained artillerists had been yanked out of the forts and sent south to go in the time. So all that was left in the forts was a hodgepodge of volunteer, infantry, and cavalry lessons. And optimistic authority in Washington thought that they could resist really well. So early is coming down from the north, takes it a day and a half to reach Washington, and finally gets to July 11th, 1864. And he ends up just to the north of the point along the lines that was started by a fort called Fort Stevens. This is a picture of Fort Stevens taken in 1865. It shows the fort was very strong. It was chock full of heavy artillery. Of course, we could get defended. Here in the background, you can see the main highway going down from the north. This direction is north. And that highway was called 7th Street Road at that time. It was called Georgia Avenue. And was the principal highway into Washington. The authorities did what they could in Washington. Turned out that there was an experienced field commander there. His name was Alexander McCook. He had commanded the force from Chicago. It's Washington by coincidence. And so the authorities put him in charge of the endangered section of the defenses of the north. And McCook set up his headquarters in what was then a little community out of the countryside in Washington City, and the district of right away. And this picture of him was taken at his headquarters in 2 days that we would have the students. Under McCook's direction, the defenders of the northern forts were an enthusiastic but rather erratic fire on the British troops. There were also infantrymen in the rifle pits just to the north of the fort. They kept the Confederate skirmishes back. Early, of course, had no idea what was going on across the wilderness. They didn't understand the inefficiency that was taking place in the command structure. They didn't realize how weak the Russian defenses were. And so he decides very quickly that he's not going to report a serious attack. He's just going to skirmish, he's going to cause whatever trouble, disruption that he can, frighten Abe Lincoln, and then withdraw this mission. Next slide. This is one of the houses here in Washington that was struck by a shell from one of the forts. The reason the picture is gibbering back and forth is because this is a 3D picture, stereo picture. We don't have some photograph together so we can get the perception of that. Ordinarily, you would clear houses out of the way to kill the fire before battle commenced. But we haven't many time to do this, and so the Confederate skirmishers worked their way into some of these houses and opened fire on the defenders. This may have been one of the houses that was occupied, or it may just have been bad anymore. Some of the houses were set on fire by the shell. This is an engraving from one of the illustrated newspapers at the time that shows the Fort Stevens battlefield. How long the improvised defense could have held out is anybody's guess, but unfortunately, that was it. On July 9th, the word of Wallace's defeat at the Knoxville finally reached Petersburg. Grant made the decision to send the rest of the 6th Corps together with another field force, the 18th Corps, to Washington to bolster the defenses. Now, bear in mind that early arrives in front of the defenses on July 11th. Grant does not send any reinforcements for the city until July. They got there fairly they arrived noon, July 11th, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They got to look at the fences where the defenders were still holding the off themselves. Somewhat ironic, the General Grant, or some General Wright, was commanding the 6th Corps and started off in 1861 as one of the men who built the defenses of Washington. They transferred to the Army of the Potomac and served in the Riley in 6th Corps in 1864. 6th Corps came back to Washington in 1865, participating in the Grand March. Grant's Sherman's forces in Washington, D.C. General Wright is riding in the head of his troops, and there are the ranks of the 6th Corps, and now it's going to be everyone from the capital in the direction of the air. President Lincoln was a very interesting observer in all of this. He seemed unable to keep away from the battlefield. He was present all around the northern defenses on several occasions, on July 11th and the next day, July 12th. And here in another illustration from one of the illustrated magazines at the time, a picture of General President Lincoln on horseback. In the afternoon of July 12th, General Wright decided it was time to make a demonstration against Sterling. Not just sit in the lines, but try to push the line of skirmishers and Confederates negotiates now. The Confederates had advanced to within something like 1,000 yards of the defenses. And that meant that they would pepper Union lines with infantry fire. About 20 people had been killed in the defenses that day. And so, towards 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Wright designates a brigade of the 6th Corps to move into position to advance immediately to the north of Fort Stevens and drive back the Confederate defenders. Just to push them back. It wasn't designed to attack out this entire army and bring on a big engagement, simply to clear the skirmish. As this attack was starting to take place, President Lincoln shows up in a carriage along with Mrs. He very sensibly decided to remain in the carriage. President Lincoln did not. He followed General Wright into the fort, and they had set up a hospital there for members of the 6th Corps and killed or wounded in fighting. President Lincoln stayed there for maybe about an hour, chatting with the people who were there from the doctors. By that time, the brigade was in position to begin the attack, and General Wright, very stupidly, invites President Lincoln to see the upcoming fight. So Lincoln climbs up over the parapet of Fort Stevens. He's in the wagon. He takes up position between gun platforms 15 and 16, along with a small group of other Roman members there to watch the fighting. So here is the President of the United States standing on the fort within easy sniper range with Confederate fire, a 7-foot target. It is still a light hat. At about that moment, there was a commotion near the president, so it collapsed. Assistant surgeon were nearly stopped, and then he said, so, Wright, who could think of nothing better to do than to join Lincoln on the parapet, standing right beside the president, and he starts barking angry orders to clear the room. Everybody else gets down, the president is still standing. So, very politely, Wright asks the president to leave. Lincoln points out that Wright was standing there too. Wright replies that this was his duty to make any impression. And so finally, this time, very badly worried indeed, Wright gathers his authority, threatens the president of the United States with arrest, and wants him to be qualified soldiers, and have them moved to the rest of step on terror. Lincoln took this as a very great deal. Here's a code of this. At the same time, the president was standing his ground on the parapet. General Wright's aide was standing close by. And according to Lincoln Lord, without thinking very much about it, he shouted at the president, "Get down, you fool."
Hello.
According to this version,
Hey.
got the president down.
I hear you're going on a trip.
It's this officer, it's the president down.
Are you all packed up? What's that? What do you got a Band-Aid on your chin for? You got a big ouch, huh? Are you okay? Yeah. I guess you don't need the Band-Aid anymore.
Apparently, in his declining years, Justice Holmes told the story to the few of his friends. And a published version of the account was later printed. It was told by a local authorities to pass But when a professional historian approached Holmes and asked for an interview to try to get a first-hand account of this incident, Holmes declined the interview. So most historians nowadays tend to think that this story is about right, maybe you'll mention whether or not it was true, it probably should have been. But it's one of the great stories of the world. Lincoln Under Fire has been depicted in a number of times, so greater or lesser degrees of accuracy. In this picture is image and that of General Wright has been superimposed onto a picture of another one of the Washington forts called Fort Totten. Fort Totten had a great big huge siege ground over the wall of event like this. Fort Stevens didn't have any mechanic like this. You've seen the photographs. Here we have another representation, a little bit more dramatic than the previous one. Again, the artillery is not depicted accurately. And Fort Stevens were firing for the British. And here's a photograph of a reenactment of the battle that took place in the 50th anniversary. Don't know where that reenactment took place. That's not where the Fort Stevens took place. Union defenders launched their attack from the earliest position, pushed back the defender skirmishers and defensive line. The distance more than 1,000 yards or so. It was a very expensive engagement. 59 people killed and more than 150 women. Every regiment was abandoned on the Union side except one. But it succeeded in completing Early's to say demoralization and the decided but it certainly made it really sit up and take notice when he was living on their own time, so that night, the Confederate defenders slipped away from the Capitol, and it was said to have two of his fellow officers. Gentlemen, we have taken Washington, but we have scared the You are a lucky girl, aren't you? The aftermath of Early's attack is not the subject of this talk. It was very big from it. Early retreated back into the Shenandoah Valley, where he maintained fully and cited federal authorities. At the end of July, the 2nd Cavalry Command and the General McCloskey into Pennsylvania, occupied the city of Chambersburg, and tried to hold it to ransom. When the residents of the city couldn't or wouldn't pay the Confederates the money that they demanded, General McCloskey ordered the entire city to be done. However understandable that might have been from the perspective of Southerners at that time, what it did was against the passions of war, and there was a great deal of additional destruction of these divisions in this house expanse. Lincoln finally put all the troops in the Valley area under one commander, General Philip Sheridan. Sheridan took over command in the autumn of 1864, and the series of battles he defeated General Early conclusively and ended the Confederate ascendancy in the Chicago Valley.
Okay, so when are you leaving tomorrow?
The Sixth Corps did not forget either its defense of Washington or the Lincoln Under Fire incident. Veterans of the Sixth Corps returned to Fort Stevens in 1920 and set up a small monument there. The plaque on that monument was based on a drawing that was made by a Washington sculptor named James E. Kelly. And Kelly got his version of the incident directly from Wright. He had gone back with Wright to Fort Stevens in 1890, which time Wright was 70 years old. They got the right to retell his story of the version getting her. So we can assume that this is probably about as accurate a depiction of that hospital that's reflected.
Oh, somebody left her daddy.
By the 1930s, the earthworks of Fort Stevens almost eroded away. Up in 1955, civilian conservation Corps came in and reconstructed the original increases. Wooden portions that held up the ramparts were duplicated in concrete. This is Fort Stevens Park today. Still very much in existence. And the Lincoln Monument is still there. The same position of the law school was replaced. So how do we sum all this up? The debate over the relative merits of grant to me is certainly not something that's going to be solved here tonight. Nothing that I can say is going to resolve that question, much less change anybody's mind in order to move it up. What is where here are a couple of my observations. Grant came to the position of Supreme Commander as having won two great victories at Vicksburg and Chattanooga. And both of these were limited objectives where the strategic goals were very clear and where Grant didn't have to worry about experience with what he was doing. When he came to the Eastern Theater in 1864, however, he faced a situation that was much more complex strategically, and where political generals were already solidly entrenched, and where, most of all, he had no familiarity with the geography of the region and very little time to learn. So basically, what Grant did in this situation, he learned what he knew how to do best. He became a field commander. Traveled with the Army of the Potomac and supervised its operations until a year later. As far as his strategic duties as general in chief were concerned, he did not pay them great attention. We've already seen how his original plan in West Virginia was not very inspired, and consciously or otherwise, when he wrote his memoirs many years later, he appropriated the strategy that his supporting officer had actually. After he moved to south with the Army of the Potomac, if anything, he paid even less attention to what was going on in the Shenandoah Valley. The relationship between Grant and Halleck was never clarified. Grant seems to have regarded him as a kind of deputy commander for operations of the facility to take action if needed. Halleck had no obligation whatsoever to do that, and while his attitude towards Grant might have been affected by some degree of slow breaks, strictly speaking, he wasn't having conviction to take action. So he did what a chief of staff was supposed to do, advised Grant, but didn't take any action himself. And so the different commander and subordinate whose attitude towards his superior seems to have been somewhat passive aggressive. It's hardly very surprising that the federal strategy is Grant is sometimes compared to General Eisenhower. When I was first coming along as an historian, it was fashionable to regard Grant as a prototype of 19th century. And you can still find interpretations of the war, which try to draw a direct connection between the Union command structure in 1864 and the Allied command structure in Europe in World War II. I'm not sure that's a very valid comparison. Grant was first and foremost a superior field commander, but he was not comfortable with the realms of that strength. Eisenhower, on the other hand, obviously got along very well. Nobody was secure, creating an allied command. But not even Eisenhower's most fervent admirers ever argued that he was a excellent field commander on the likes of General Bradley for the battle of October. So, in my opinion, there really isn't a whole lot of common ground between the two officers. The real efficiency in this situation is in the package. And that was odd because we didn't have a commanding general, didn't have a chief of staff. But the stature of General Lee was so great that by 1864, he had really to express his intentions and everybody went on. He cultivated good relations with his subordinates, and so when something had to be done, immediately there was no lack of well-intentioned, capable subordinates that had a flair for doing the right thing and doing that stuff. So, ironically, it's the Confederate command structure that was efficient in the command structure of the situation. Now, however you want to regard or assess Reagan's leading, the fact that they were both very great military commanders, and they were really of admiration. It's a pleasure to be a student of their campaigns. So, thank you very much.
Sure. Yeah. Anybody have any questions for? Yeah, but I'm not early attack.